As a technologist and CTO, Sigmund built a career on creating the future instead of reacting to it. As enterprise architect for ICANN, he led the effort to expand the internet to handle multinational character sets for domain names. As a divisional CTO of WatchGuard Technologies, he created the first wireless firewall. And as CTO of Touchstone Software, he created the first subscription-based antivirus. With that, Sig, please take over.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the thing I say about the subscription for antivirus, it was a great idea at the time, and now I have to apologize for it, because when you pay $80 a year for Norton, that was my idea, but it was only $5 a year then.
Okay.
So those were the days. Hi, just one quick apology that they decided to tear up the street in front of my house starting this morning at 7. Even though there's been a problem there for about 3 months. And so today's the day. So if you hear rumbling in the background, that's me. My apologies. I'll talk loud enough, maybe it won't show up. I want to talk about where business is headed post-pandemic. There's certainly a lot of opinions going back and forth, but I've gone through a few surveys, and the reason technologists and engineers have maybe a step up on this is we went through this transition of handling remote workers about 25-ish years ago. And so we went through those the pains involved in doing that and handling that, and we've been doing it that way for quite a while now. So I'm going to share my screen, and Don has the slide deck so you can get it from him. Go. All right. Somebody tell me it came out okay. We look good?
It came out okay. Looks
Excellent.
good.
Thank you. Okay, so what does post-pandemic business look like? There's a couple of things I want to go over. Mainly, remote work is here to stay, different levels, but it's here to stay at some level. The generations are handling it differently, slightly, and there will be changes to the office, but more importantly, changes to how we define work. And that's why I let in with the engineers, because engineering has gone through that. And I want to talk a little bit about how the changes we had to make to allow for remote workers or a disparate or workforce. And then I want to cover something that's getting a lot of ink right now called the Great Resignation. It's a play on the Great Recession. Well, at the end, you'll find out that I actually don't believe in it, but we could go over the pieces of it. I'll give my opinion on that. So initially, we went from 25% of Americans working from home to 62% in about 2 months, about a little over a year ago, and it's gone a bit higher than that. So remote work is here to stay. We did it quickly, and we found that the productivity either increased slightly or stayed the same, and companies reduced their office space because of it. But there was definitely increased stress and anxiety on the part of the workers. A number of surveys I've gone through have shown that, though, again, you have to sort of take the, think about the number, about those surveys being done end of last year. There was a lot of stress and anxiety, period, about both the pandemic and the survivability of the company, as well as the new work environment. But nevertheless, it is true that there were some downsides to all of that. However, even though the CEO of an office space company has said that only people in the office are truly engaged in the company, other surveys have a different opinion that show that there's been from a slight to a substantial increase in engagement in remote workers. And so somewhat age-based, even boomers have an increase in engagement from working from home. Also interesting to note that the number of people who want to continue working remotely, not necessarily 100%, but continue some remote work, was high. This was end of last year, and it's gotten higher now. So it's gone from 75% of millennials to in the 80%. And even boomers are a large number like the working remotely. And from a company point of view, it's something to really to consider because it does give you access to a more diverse workforce. It gives you access to more people. There are some cost savings involved. And one of the cost savings, not just the office space, et cetera, but a number of companies, larger companies, Google, I believe, was the first, but certainly Silicon Valley companies are the first to pay people based on where they live. So if you're an engineer living in Santa Clara or in Silicon Valley, you're going to get more money than the same engineer who lives in Salt Lake City, and be equally happy with it because, you know, the cost of living is different. So a larger company that can make this distinguish those are finding savings in that form. And certainly increased flexibility. Now, one of the reasons,
Sigmund,
yeah,
didn't they do this after the fact? In other words, a lot of people migrated away from the valley for lifestyle reasons and subsequently found their pay was reduced after the fact.
Google was doing that, and that's what got all the press because people were unhappy about that. But they also put it into their hiring. So in other words, if I hire somebody who didn't move there but lives in Salt Lake City or lives in, you know, some other place, then they would look to what would be the right amount if we had an office there.
Right, that's a normal practice. You know, you'll hire locally and your wage scales will be based on the local market. I think doing what they did was not a usual practice.
You're right, and that's what made the news. But and I agree, and I wonder about that. But at the same time, you know, if you move to a place that has a significant change in cost of living, you know, I got to question. It doesn't seem inappropriate for the company to adjust for that as well, and that's where Google is trying to you know be the first company that would do that type of thing. And it has its followers and its non-followers, but it is a real possibility.
Yeah, I understood that. I found that is kind of a dichotomy with the typical message that we've understood emanating from Silicon Valley over the years, is that they pay the people based on the fact that they're the smartest, the brightest, and the best.
Right.
And then, whoops, you're in Salt Lake City. What happened to that?
Yeah. But for other companies, it is a reason to have a change in pricing, and to the point now, which gets away from the moving away from Silicon Valley, you know, idea, but to say I could look for somebody in another place, and if they have what I need and I can handle that remote work, then I can afford to pay the person less. And you're right, that is common enough. And I certainly have seen it myself. My own team at ICANN was in 5 locations, from India to Israel to, you know, Chicago. And their pay was, one of my best architects in Israel was making less than one of my mediocre programmers in Los Angeles. And I felt bad at the beginning, but the reality is he was very, very happy with the amount of money he was making.
So Sigmund, though, one of the problems with remote, and if you'll touch on it, then that's great, is the overhead burden and implications for the employer if you have a remote workspace. Because if I'm living in New York as an employee, my company has to deal with payroll and my tax in New York.
Absolutely.
Plus, I can create nexus, which might not have existed otherwise, which creates problems for the company. So that whole thing needs now, how do we manage where people live? And I know some companies are actually saying you can live in one of 15 states. Just with a company last night.
Sure.
That's where their employee base is. So they're saying, we'll let you live in one of these, but you have to, you know, not, you can't do choice.
Right. And what ICANN did as well was, if it was another country, then we went into a contractor relationship, because that's a whole nother rabbit hole. But still, it is something that remote work gives you the possibility. And thank you. There are other sides of that you really need to be aware of, but it's still something that's there that's not if everybody's in this office. Okay, so This survey, and when you get it from Don, you can see the fine print down there at the bottom, but January of this year, just employees, how many of them, over 50%, I think about 50% or over 50%, 3 days a week or more from home. And so it's interesting to see, what do employees want first? I'll get to the employers in a second. But what I like to say is that work-life balance, what we used to call that's fallen out of favor for a while, is coming back a bit, because employees have spent a year or more being able to be at home and work what I call sort of split shift, but the reality is in and out. You're not sitting at a desk for 4 hours lunch and then 4 hours, but you're getting the amount of work done, but it's spread over the day. And that allows, a little more flexibility there. Companies have been really thinking in terms of work-life integration as a counterpoint. There's actually just to tell a story on somebody, there's a quote from one of the founders on the wall in the conference room at McDermott and Bull that says, hopefully nobody here will get mad at me for this, but it says basically, if you're not the type of person who's thinking about work every moment of the day, then we're probably not going to place you. So, that's sort of the older thing. What the millennials are looking for, what the employees are thinking in terms of, is that flexible work from home isn't just not being in the office, it's also taking off time to go pick up your kid from school and then come back, and there's 15, 20 minutes out of your day, and you come back and you work a bit at night, and that type of flexibility. That's what they're looking for. At the same time, the executives have a different opinion, where 70%, I think it was 70, let's see, 30, almost 70% want you in the office at least 3 days a week. So to be able to do the culture. Now, I'm an executive too, and I know some of where this is coming from, because if everybody's in the office as a manager, as an executive, it's just easier. And engineering has gone through this over the last 25, 30 years. It's easier to manage people. It's easier to create a culture. It's easier to reward people. Have your secretary buy some bagels, poof, everybody feels a little bit better. You can't do that when they're remote. And I had talks with executives, and I find it really interesting. It took me a number of times before I've actually thought to turn it around. And I was told, it's if everybody's in the office, I can get things done faster. If I have a question, I can just go ask them. I go to their desk and ask them. I get the answer, poof, moved on my day. Whereas remotely, it's too hard to do that. And I finally put myself in the part. What you're saying is that you got to interrupt your employee from what it is they were doing, made them stop what they were doing, come up to answer your question that you probably could have Googled, and then they got to go back to work. So as an executive, it made it easier, but dude, you didn't make your workers more productive. You didn't make it a better, you weren't really, it made your job easier. So, let's call a spade, as they say, and say, this is what I see here in executives wanting people in the office has been more focused on helping them do their job, but it does interrupt the employee. Now, I want to talk about engineering has been here. We were in this spot many, many years ago. And just a quick history on creating software. It used to be a monolithic thing. You spent months coming up with a spec. And then they said they spent months or years writing it, and they tested it, and then they gave you the result. Engineering doesn't do that anymore. If you've heard of Agile, it's where engineering says, basically the mantra for engineers, I know what I'm doing for the next 2 weeks. I have an idea what I'm doing for the 2 weeks after that. I have no clue what I'm doing the 2 weeks after that. So all of software engineering in this hybrid model has changed. So there are other reasons for the change, but it supports the hybrid model in that it's going to a place where it's you have a lot of shorter deliverables. You have ways of showing the work you've gotten done that don't require people get in meetings and talk to people and say, here, wave their hands and say, here's where I am. So executives are a little stronger about people coming back to work than employees are. The executives are running the company, so that can happen. But, again, if the employees don't show up, or you don't get enough employees, you're in trouble there. So you need to be cognizant of that. Okay. Now let's talk about how the generations are. Actually, Don, I have no idea how long I'm supposed to talk. So what's my...
It's about 8:35 now. I think if you want to talk for another 20 minutes, 25 minutes,
Cool.
we're good.
Plenty. Thank you.
Can I weigh in here a bit?
Absolutely. Please, the questions and comments and actually rebuttals are welcome.
So apart from recruiting, I do executive coaching for C-suite and their teams. And this hybrid model is what a lot of people are talking about. But when you talked about employees perhaps not wanting to go back, I don't know that's necessarily the sentiment, because a lot of employees, senior executives and junior, feel that there are no boundaries. They're working in their bedroom and they start with their PJs and they end with their PJs. And there have been no clear lines. Second, the expectation from employers is you can be reached at any time. So that a lot of my coaching has been to senior executives about drawing boundaries. Third, a downside is when there is a new employee to get assimilated with culture. Culture is a very big piece. That is a real problem because you don't have, there's a different dynamic. When you sit across from somebody, you talk with them and you establish that rapport. So that's the third part. And, then there's the other weird stuff of some employees coming up with workers' comp claims because they got some kinds of pains from incorrect desks at home or chairs or stuff like that. So employers have had to see the next step of, oh, do you need a standing desk? We'll pay for a chair. We'll pay X amount for your internet. So there's my sense in this talking with a lot of people is that the hybrid model is something that possibly might end up being something of the future, because of a lot of my clients have said, maybe till July or September, we'll do 100% remote. Then we'll start with hybrid. We'll come down with the space that we need. So a certain amount of people are going to be in at all times. And then maybe one day a week or one day every 2 weeks, the whole company is together from however forum they're doing. So it's very interesting and complex, and I think it will emerge.
I absolutely agree with you that the hybrid model is the goal, because getting together at some level is very useful. When I talk about the generations in a moment, I have another answer there. Engineers got around some of what you're saying in that communication. Again, I use them as an example only because they've been doing it for so long, but communication is asynchronous. It's expected to be asynchronous. So there is not the expectation that if I email somebody a question or I am them a question that I get it immediately. And there becomes a tiered thing. In other words, if you need an answer immediately, you have to text them. There's a whole structure, because these are engineers. Of course, there's a whole structure, but there becomes a way of communicating. But asynchronous is one of the keys for one of your points. But it does require someone like you, thank you, to coach them to how to do that. I agree. But a hybrid, I think, is definitely where we're headed. But a great segue. So I want to talk about Gen Z for a moment. And these guys are in college, high school and college now. Their need to be in the office is a little higher because they don't have a work habit yet. But at the same time, this is something that's hard for us boomers to understand. But the Gen Zers are used to building relationships, deep relationships with people they have never physically met. And that's hard for someone like me to really get, but they do. And so some millennials as well. The example I love to give is my own daughter moved to Japan for 4 years to teach English, never missed a D&D night with her friends that are here in California and now Washington and a few other places. So, her set of friends are as much online as anything. So there is what we boomers are very comfortable meeting somebody, looking them in the eye and building a relationship directly in person. The millennials and Zs, especially the Zs, are very used to doing that online. So, I mean, if I go back in time, we can also talk to each other. We've done interviews on the phone. And to our parents, that would be, you know, a little weird. So we'll see where it goes. But that's one. The millennials are very comfortable with remote work. The numbers keep going up. You'll see the numbers there. The 84% want to work full time. The number that's interesting that's gone up from about 9 months ago, it was 32% of millennials would leave the job if it required 100% time in the office. Today, that number is in the mid to high 40%. So 45 to 47% would leave if it's 100% time back in the office. So that as it becomes closer to reality, the number's actually growing. And then boomers, oddly enough, like the remote work as well, surveys are showing that a number of them are changing jobs to find one that allows them to work remotely. So just a small thing on where this is headed. Now I want to talk about the office itself. And Dave had some ideas here. Physical, now here's the key to this, and this is going to be interesting, and some of you guys are going to know more about this than I do, but some of the ideas that are really being promoted on how to set up your office to handle post-pandemic, you know, people coming in, I think are truly going to happen, but I question how long they're going to happen. I question how long our memory and our desire to be safe from the virus is going to persist. But physical layout changes, the idea of having office neighborhoods, so the number of people in the company that you physically see a lot is reduced. A number of companies, depending on how many days they're spending at home, there's a tipping point at about 2 to 3 days in the office where you switch from a permanent desk to hoteling, with obviously cleaning in between. Something I think is definitely going to happen. The days of open food in the kitchen are pretty much over. I heard this great joke. I said, remember back when we used to, spit on candles on a birthday cake and then serve it to everybody? Yeah, good times. That's not happening again. So, a lot of that kind of open buffets, are really going to be a long time coming back, if at all. Support for hybrid meetings is a must. Assume on most of your meetings, somebody's not in the office. That changes the look of the conference rooms. Again, when I worked at ICANN, it's only 400 people in the company, but it's extremely global. And I would say 90% of the meetings I had at least one remote person. So the conference room had multiple screens, microphones, et cetera. So there's a change there. And one thing I really think is going to happen is that the idea of coming to work sick is going to go away. That's going to become a no-no where it used to be okay. But there are safety protocols that are expected. Again, there's a pretty high cost to some of these. And I must admit, I question how long they're going to last. And I'm open to other input here, but marking the floor to keep social distancing and doing temperature checks and whatnot. I can see doing that for the first few months, but I think it's going to drop off pretty quickly.
Well, Sigmund, the CDC guidance has said spacing doesn't matter, right? It's your duration, right?
And that's newer than this definition, but thank you.
Right. So so temperature checks, that's pretty much gone from what I can see.
Exactly.
Vaccine required, you got a HIPAA problem.
True.
Because we're seeing that Cal OSHA just came out with some revised regulations that are pending final authorization and probably some refinement. But if you keep records as to your employees being vaccinated under HIPAA, you keep it for the duration of their employment plus 30 years.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's
that just told me don't keep it.
right. And so how do you even go through that?
Right.
And you've got places like New York that say we're going to have Yankee Stadium segregated between vaccinated and unvaccinated. Well,
that's not going to work either. Yeah.
Well, given the disparities among certain ethnic groups and rates of vaccination, that's going to be an ugly picture.
Right. Right. So a lot of this, a lot of these, that's why I put this in there. This is from this is a little older, and I wanted to leave it in there because it's what this, 4 months ago, this was what a lot of people were saying was going to take. And I really think a lot of it is not going to happen as much now, or if it does, it's going to be short-lived. So budget that accordingly. Going through the effort, like you said, of a whole new ventilation system, that's a huge cost. And how long do we need it? So it's out there, be aware of it, but be aware also, this is not necessarily as big a part. Some of the other parts about hybrid meetings and the way the kitchen is, I think those are going to survive, and there are things you need to be able to address there. Now I want to talk a little more importantly about changes to how we work. And first off, on the right there, what you see is the difference between employers and employees about how fast the offices are, how fast they're willing to come back to the office. And I have a real life example in the networking group Ethos. The restaurant they go to, the Citrus Cafe, allowed them to have 30 people in the restaurant on their meeting in May, the last Saturday in May, or fourth Saturday in May. And so I was working with them to set up a hybrid meeting because 30 people could be at the cafe, and then everybody else would be online. Ended up, they went totally virtual because they only got a couple of people willing to come into the restaurant. So it's sort of the same example of the executives versus the employees, how fast they were willing to come back. I believe that Ethos will have the hybrid model, but May was too soon for their employees, comfort level.
But well, keep in mind that coming back also has the element, is this a good use of my time to physically drive? So we're back to the remote, because I know, talking with people, they won't go to a networking event if they have to drive 45 minutes to get there, when we can just sit and do this.
Actually, that is one of the prime drivers of the reason the way we work is going to change. It is that we've discovered things we can do virtually that we couldn't do in person. Boot Camp is another networking group that used to have a Friday morning meeting in the office. And it had, what, 20, 30 people. Now it runs about 120 or 150 people, because it includes people from San Francisco and San Diego. So there are things you can do, and it's not quite equivalent, but for business, it's the same thing. Having somebody in your meeting from the San Francisco office is a given now, where it wouldn't have necessarily been before. And I have to admit, personally, when I have a phone conversation with someone, sometimes I think, geez, I wish I could have done that on Zoom. It would have been nicer to see them and wave at them or something. And so, it's interesting what we're finding new things to do with the new technology. One of the old rules in innovation is, the first thing you do with new technologies, you do old things in a new way. The second thing you do is new things you never thought you could do in the new technology. And that's what we're starting to get to. So changes to how we work. We left quickly, but we can return slowly. So it's something to consider. Creating rules for the hybrid workforce changes how you recognize performers. The attendance model changes. You have resource changes. Hopefully, maybe the lobby won't change. If we don't have to do temperature checks and don't have to do other things, then your lobby doesn't have to become a different kind of a place. But you need a set of rules. I think employees are going to be more comfortable if they know what is and isn't expected of them, and what we're doing to keep them safe, et cetera, when they come back. So having that type of document is a good thing for your employees. But what I want to say, well, actually, it's the next slide. Here we go. Here's the new way we are going to work. And this is something, again, engineering has gone through over the last 25 years, but the rest of the company is going to go through now, or can go through now. When do people go to the work, and when does work go to the people? What do you do in how you define what needs to be done? The more you can define intermediate deliverables, the easier it is to have somebody own the entire task and go off and do it wherever they are. And then you get back together to show the results. And that's what engineering has gone through in the last whatever years, is we've moved to that model from, I'll wait for marketing to give me a spec. When they give me a spec, I'll create that. And then I'll give it back to them and they'll make changes, on it goes, right? And that's not it anymore. Now it's a multi-stakeholder model where people talk about where we are at every step. And the redefinition of engineering is every day I create something that runs. So it's a deliverable. So that's part of what you have to figure out, a way to change the what everybody does to work to this, for the hybrid model, for remote work to actually work. And so you get all the other advantages, but it does take some work to change the way things are operating. Okay. So that I'm going to go over the Great Resignation in a moment, but the idea behind where companies are going to be post-pandemic, first is, I truly believe it's going to be slower than the executives want it to be. I think there's going to be some pushback from employees about how often they come back to the office and how soon they come back to the office. One example I like to give, my son is a programmer, Salesforce and .NET programmer for Massimo Med Devices. He's been there for 7.5 years, straight out of college. He doesn't like looking for work. He doesn't like changing jobs. He's happy there. He's looking for a new job because they just went from 100% work from home to 100% go back to the office.
Wow.
And he's 31, so it puts him right in the millennial thing. So there's a guy who is as loyal as you can get. I love to try to push him to do more, but hey, dads are not supposed to stress out their sons, so let them live their life. But here I am saying he's ready to find another job because of that. So he's my poster boy of where some of that is going. So that's, I think the remote work hybrid model, I'm not saying that he refused to go back to the office. I think he'd be just as happy today as he was 2 years ago if he was in the office 2 days a week. So something to consider. So that's sort of where things are going. So, but let's talk about the next thing. Actually, any other comments on this before we go to the Great Resignation? No, good. Okay. Let's talk about the Great Resignation. It's really popular. It's got a nice little, let's be clear where it came from. It's one professor at one college wrote a paper. So before we start saying this is everybody's saying this, it's one professor at one college wrote one paper. But it's hit it's really taken off well. And there's some good points in there, which basically is, with uncertainty, people stayed in their job because both either their job or the company's survival wasn't guaranteed. You hunkered down, and for the last, year and something, people have been sticking with whatever they have. Now, and during that time, we're talking about PTSD for the pandemic, and I don't mean to minimize, other PTSDs, but there is a reaction to that. People are I think, whether they had high risk, low, and by high risk, I mean health-wise, low reward jobs like being a waitress or waiter, or burnout during the stress as an essential worker. There is an expectation. There was a survey done recently of teachers, and a huge percentage are going to leave teaching, as in high 30s. And will not be a teacher in the fall. And it's not because, it's not saying we want more money and then I'll be a teacher. It's saying the stress of doing the remote teaching, the stress of all that they've gone through over the last year, they're reevaluating whether or not they even want to be a teacher. So, those type of things are leading to this idea of the Great Resignation. Also, that lack of commute time, that work-life balance they had for remote working got them to thinking, wait a minute. I started in, everybody said, get a job, do that, retire when you get old. That's the life, that's the lifestyle, do that. Now I'm in a situation where I've spent a year seeing other sites, doing other things, maybe changing my priorities. So that leads to people saying, maybe I want a different career path. So those add up to the why people might be looking anyway. And then you add that companies reopening means there's a lot more opportunities, which is always a chance for employees to move. And you say that 42%, and that's not just millennials. Millennials are higher, but that's across the board. 42% will leave if you remove remote working entirely. But I do believe, while I'm not willing to say it's at the level of the Great Resignation, of being called the Great Resignation, in every uptick, there's movement. In every uptick of employment, there's movement. And the key as executives in a company is to realize the reality that if people are moving, it's going to be your best people that move. It's always been the thing that the mediocre people stick where they are. They're not getting the offers, but your best people are the ones that get all the offers and off they go. So while there will be some movement anyway for all these reasons, I'm not sure it will be called the Great Resignation eventually, but it is something. We are in an uptick in employment, which means it's time for executives to really show that, to find out what it is their employees. There's any number of get the coach back here. There's any number of articles out there about how to, it's time to listen to your employees, as if you didn't have to before, but there's a lot of talk about that. So I think that's an important part of the post-pandemic, is how do you hold on to the people you want to hold on to? Thank you. I don't know how I did on my timing, but it's almost 9 o'clock. So there you go.
Perfect.
So Sigmund, I think your final point about the Great Resignation, is on point, because we always see after the recession an uptick.
Right.
One of the big concerns, though, is, the grass is always greener on, the other side, and will opportunities be different? And it's an opportunity for employers to differentiate themselves. But part of what the pandemic showed, for Google as an example, it's anecdotal, but you speak to Google employees, and when they realized that when you take away the Googleplex, no massages, no food,
right.
no, games, and all of the culture aspects, they're going, my job isn't very fun. Exactly. Or, people can be jerks. And so we're seeing that. And so I think it's going to create an opportunity for employers to differentiate themselves by the way they do work or create culture.
And the thing I want to add to that is that with the remote work, with the companies that do support remote work, what that means is the number of competitors you have for those employees has just gone up. Mm-hmm. Maybe not, hugely, but it has gone up. And so that's something to consider as well, that the company based in Seattle will allow me to work from home 5 days a week. And if my own company says I have to be in the office and commute to LA 5 days a week, that's a big change. So, lesser change, if makes it, is how you could react to that, right? So, but it does increase the number of competitors you have in this uptick.
I'd like to weigh in a little bit here. So first of all, I'm in Santa Clara County just now. So I'm bear testimony to the fact that you could be anywhere and work from anywhere.
I grew up in Santa Clara. I love it.
Yep, I'm in Morgan Hill.
Ah, okay.
Prior to the pandemic, I was convinced that I could only function, especially since I had very strong client relations for my recruiting business and the coaching. I thought, I need to be upfront. But that whole thing has changed. I tell a lot of my clients, I could be in the next building to you and you wouldn't know. But so with that being said, though, I still come back to the dynamic, the culture, like somebody mentioned, I forget who just now, about the massages and the interaction and the perks. Mm-hmm. So I recently coached a group of kids, millennials, in an ad agency in Chicago. And that's exactly what they said. They said, you know what, we feel that we have the responsibility, but we don't have the camaraderie that goes with it. And they were all between, I would say, 25 and maybe up to 40, no more than that. And these were people, they were all in a Chicago complex, but this is a large ad agency. So many of them didn't know each other. And as through the coaching, one of them had started to go back and met another person and was so thrilled. Hey, hi, coaching buddy. So they started to feel that joy with that personal interaction. So that's a really big one. And that support that people just basically are looking for, that interaction, that whole thing, I don't think that will ever go away. So companies such as Twitter, Snapchat have told the employees that they can work remotely forever if they want. But they are also offering a hybrid option. You can come in if you need. So how they're going to account for space and such, I don't know, but that's definitely something that they're navigating too. And then also to come back to the space of engineers, they are a whole different, engineers and R&D are a completely separate segment. They do work by themselves. The interaction, the engagement is at a different level. So they used to be in silos, and to a large degree, they know how to function from one step to the next. That's different. But I'll say the very last thing and then shut up, which is.
No, I thank you. This is good.
I recently had an order for a CFO, which I'm currently working on. I'm still trying to iron out the whole dynamics of this. And the CEO said to me, "Oh, Lorraine, you can go nationwide and hire anybody from me because this is going to be remote." And then in the same breath as we're talking, he talks about how this person needs to be a visible leader and make an impact on the company. And I asked him, and how are you planning to do that? With somebody sitting in Colorado or New York or wherever. And he says, oh, well, everything can be done on Zoom. I said, I think the perception of the team concept you're looking for and the visible leader, it's not that easy to come through. But they're a logistics company and they did extremely well last year. So he's basing his success on that.
Well, and I think in my experience, you can't have everybody remote. There are people who can do it. And so you allow those people to do it. In other words, sometimes the expertise or the abilities of that person are worth the cost of having them almost never in the office. Engineers are an exception. They're introverts by majority.
Yeah.
I mean, the joke about engineers, and it's not a joke because it's true, that they'll IM somebody who's 2 desks over rather than just raise their hand or something. So that fits a little bit, but you're right. But sometimes there's 2 things about remote. One, and I want to go back to whether it was Larry or Dave who said about the hybrid model being the winner, because it allows you to go back and focus and not have interruptions and get a bunch done, and then spend another day where you're not as effective, not as productive, but you're in the office, making, connections, as it were. So the hybrid helps that, but realize that sometimes the skill set you need, you don't need to, you get to find the best person, not the best person in your county.
Right. But the thing to remember, I think, is the value of culture, which Lorraine has really brought forward. That becomes the challenge to this productivity, because your productivity surveys that you quoted, that's an up and down. Companies see productivity and then the burnout hit, and then they realize, especially in more creative or we're building the future, that requires people to collaborate in ways, and we haven't necessarily figured those out. And so I think that's the challenge, is how do we do that and keep a company culture that creates the loyalty that your son had?
Right.
There's our opportunity. No, I just think that's our opportunity to build effective companies, is that aspect.
There are a set of techniques and knowledge and experience that we have yet to create yet to understand on how to build relationships through a little freaking camera on our laptop. I mean, I've gone to classes in the past on how to do an interview over the phone, and stand up, walk around so that you can project the energy. There's some tricks on how to do that better. We're at the forefront of doing that again here. And again, that's where I really want to lean on the millennials and the Zs who are doing that a lot. One thing I read once about the millennials and the Zs that I loved was, us old people are called digital immigrants. We sort of know our way around, but it's not our native language. And the millennials are the digital natives. Well, the difference between the millennials and the Zs is that all that digital stuff for the millennials, that was version 1, and it didn't even really work all that well. The Zs are natives with stuff that actually works. The Zs are with a phone that they can look up everything, as opposed to an iPod that has a bunch of music. So, I think as we're getting forward, I think that the workers' comfort with remote communication and remote relationships is going to be confusing at best to this older people who built our work habits around being in person. And while we say it can't be done, what I'm really saying when I say that is I don't know how to do it, and I'm too used to doing it in person. The other story I give is my daughter. If you've ever had a cat, a cat chooses the person, not the other way around. And one of our cats chose my daughter. It was her cat. She passed away, old age, but all of her support, all of her friends were there for her when it happened online. Nobody came to my house. And so that's a level of support that people my age assume comes from in person. She never expected in person. Shared videos of her cat. Well, I went back and forth. It was a thing and it was a few years ago, but it was where the millennials are. So it gave me an insight to say, it's there. We're not ready in business, really. We don't have quite the tools and quite the habits, but I think it's attainable. And so we'll have to see how that goes. But I'm 100% in favor of the hybrid, not the 100%, because it gets really hard. Go ahead, Don. Sorry.
I think it does speak to the hybrid model. There's no way to go back to the way things were before. And I don't think full remote works. So personally. Well,
I'd love to say when people talk about going back, I said, give me an example where going back to the old way was a successful plan.
Well, they were successful.
Just one on the concept of what will an office and how can a hybrid office work. I posted a video of Microsoft Teams design of offices and conference rooms of the future to make hybrid work. So it's in the chat if anyone's interested. It's a YouTube.
Someone mentioned there's a difference between engagement and productivity. And I agree, but the interesting thing is the surveys I'm reading show an increase in both separately for remote workers. And that's a little, that was a surprise to me. I mean, I expected the increase in productivity because interruptions, but the increase in engagement was a surprise to me. But the surveys are showing an increase in engagement, especially with millennials. And sometimes, I remember when maybe it's because you have to. In other words, you're not in the office, you can't make assumptions. I know when I was remote to the company in Seattle, we talked about one at the very beginning, I kept track of where people were because I knew I wasn't there. And I actually had people saying, hey, where's John today? I said, oh, he's got a dentist appointment. I'm 1,000 miles away, but I knew where John was and they didn't because I had to. So maybe that's part of the engagement.
Cool.
Thank you all.
Okay. Sig, thank you very much. I think it was very well done and very well received.
Well, thank you.
And with that, if there are no other questions, we will see you all next month.